I'm going to talk probably for about 15 minutes or so, maybe less, 10 minutes, about graphic ethnography, and especially using sequential art not just as an output to communicate our insights from anthropology, but also as a method to kind of think through important anthropological concepts around temporality, spatiality, relationality, and how thinking through comics can actually help us think more effectively as ethnographers. So to introduce ourselves, I've been thinking about comics with Chitra Venkataramani, who's also at ANU. So I'll be drawing on my work, but also her work, which is set in coastal communities of Mumbai, and thinking about the ways in which those are represented in all sorts of kind of graphic imaginaries, from engineers and coastal architects and urban planners and designers and mappers to fishery communities, and the visual style that's deployed to think about these spaces and communities visually. My work didn't seem, or might not seem, like an obvious candidate for graphic ethnography, since I'm an anthropologist of finance, which seems like it might be the farthest thing away from comics. Like, why in the world would you read a comic book about insurance for weather disasters in Paraguay? And one of the reasons, the provocations that can maybe turn methodologically to thinking visually as a comics writer and artist, is that those concepts in anthropology often are abstracted very far away from the worlds in which I lived as a field worker, and in which they sort of touch down for the people that I worked with and care about. So figuring out how to re-embed those financial logics and systems in the environments through which they take shape became a methodological question for me that shaped my fieldwork practice, and also a set of techniques to communicate methodologically and theoretically some of the insights about anthropology of finance. So the first provocation, you might be like, oh, whatever, comics, I'm going to tune out for now and have my afternoon snooze while you do the comics and ethnography session. But my provocation is that ethnography has long been engaged with the graphic, so it's something that we should kind of all take seriously. Ethnography and illustration can share a long history, whether it's technical drawing as a key fieldwork skill. If we think of those sort of early expeditions, many of the early field workers were trained in a very interdisciplinary sense to be natural historians. And with that came a toolkit of visualization, kind of mapping, drawing material culture, some archaeologists in the room that can attest to the ways in which we're trained up in technical drawing as a key kind of skill and method to turn our attention to the landscapes, people, and material culture in which the anthropological encounter is centered. So the disciplinary history rooted in natural history and travel writing privileged and prioritized a key set of skills around illustration and technical drawing. In Paraguay, this had some kind of really interesting effects. These are pages from a giant German handbook that was written by the German ambassador to Paraguay in the 1920s. His name was also Schuster, and so Schuster and Schuster sit next to each other in a lot of my citations. Not being the kind of technical drawing Schuster. And these are some of the kind of illustrations that kind of come up in his mapping. And what's really interesting is that the German colonists, he was looking after German colonists in Paraguay that had bought up vast tracts of land and were very carefully kind of remaking them in kind of carefully planned and coordinated kind of reimagining of the countryside. So kind of German tradition of kind of urban architecture and mapping combined with Herderian theories of land and folk come together to kind of reimagine and revisualize the countryside, and also to kind of draw it, right? So the kind of technical drawing, this is a really key way in which that was kind of disseminated and kind of turned into a key resource for Paraguayan agrarian planning. You might recognize some of these. Not only do anthropologists make use of a tradition of technical drawing that's has a long genealogy in our field, but anthropological and archaeological kind of locations were the inspiration for many of the great 20th century kind of comics. And here have Hergé's Adventures of Tintin, drawing on not only South American, but also kind of Pacific Islander kind of imaginaries, and picking up archaeological and anthropological work and sifting it through a kind of comics imaginary. There's some great work in archaeology kind of about this as well. And kind of all this is to say that this sort of cross-pollination is often quite uncomfortable in the sense that the sort of reimagining of anthropological insights from the lens of sort of sensationalist storytelling and the exoticism that comes from the kind of colonial lens is something that the comics tradition brings with it. So I'm going to, in kind of brief sketches, walk you through 5 approaches to graphic ethnography as you're thinking about how potentially you might use this method in some of your own work. And this is to sort of open it up a bit so that you don't have to think that graphic ethnography means you need to make a 120-page graphic novel is the There might be some other things you could do with it. So here we go. First, how many of you, hands up, take visual field notes? Yeah! So these might be kind of doodles, sketches, little observations, or they might be sort of more fully realized kind of sketches and pages, right? I'd really like this page from Carolyn Hendrickson's kind of work because she's, again, sort of picking up some of the tropes from Malinowski's tent to kind of rethink her own kind of engagement and inhabiting kind of the field. So every time we're drawing, just as we're kind of intertextual when we're writing, we're also intertextual when we're drawing, picking up certain images and styles that we recognize from ethnographic kind of work more broadly, and often reimagining that through our own visual practice. A second set of approaches that are kind of quite popular are visual explainers. Hands up, anyone do these? Slightly less popular? Yeah, infographics are kind of something that dominate the consulting world. In anthropology, the visual explainers can be really fun. So the one on the left is kind of visual reimagining of the GEMS manifesto for the study of capitalism. You can find it on the GEMS, the webpage. And in that sense, it's sort of picking up some of the key concepts and providing a sort of illustrated flowchart that can walk you through the art of it. The one on the right is super interesting. This is Nick Souzanis's work. He's a really kind of important graphic ethnographer, graphic anthropologist. And this is a kind of piece based on his ethnography at the IPCC kind of climate talks. And the piece that came out is called The Fragile Framework. And he uses the motif of frameworks where you sort of see overlaying of kind of designs and relationships, the recurrence of kind of the sort of stylized frames and framework, framing the kind of earth and landscape in different ways, the hurricane, earth, and mountain, as a visual style that moves throughout the piece. So the kind of concepts that he's trying to develop in the wider piece resonate with the visual styles that he's developing, and he tracks that over the course of his explainer. But you can see, too, that it's quite text-heavy, right? Like, there's not a sort of story here, rather. It's explaining a concept and walking you through kind of some of its kind of key principles and using sort of design to help you with that. A third approach is autoethnography, and this is quite popular in graphic ethnography. Leticia Bonanno is a kind of key voice here, and much of her graphic practice is sort of taking you along through her field work as she's a sort of illustrated kind of protagonist, as it were, in her pages. And much of this sort of meditates on identity, place, engagement, kind of with our field relations, kind of more broadly through a visual idiom. If you're thinking anthropology and comics, this might be what comes most readily to mind, so we might call this sequential art in comics. And sequential art in the sense that you have panels that tell a sequence, right? You're playing with time when you're mapping things out in a series of panels, cutting up the kind of visual field and moving from one panel to the next in order to tell a story in time. And sequence can give you some really powerful tools to think about kind of how temporality functions in your narrative. The page on the right is from The King of Bangkok, which is Claudio Sofrozzetti's masterpiece. And the one on the left is a shorter kind of webcomic on the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in the Caribbean. And the final approach thinks about graphic ethnography not so much as output, but as a tool for collaboration. So when you're doing one of these projects, you're almost certainly kind of bringing bigger teams of people together. And Heather pointed to this really effectively in her presentation, that in many cases, the sort of method itself is about curating and collecting those collaborations and partnerships. And when you have a multimodal project, it's necessarily doing that because you're bringing kind of multiple people together and multiple perspectives. Whether it turns out as a series of collages or art installations or a kind of meditation on practice and collaboration, it's quite open in terms of what you're actually producing. So let's do some graphic ethnography. This is your task. We're going to make a one-pager. So think first about bringing text and images together. You can Google search Sopranzetti's little kind of meditation on the making of a page if you have a digital device, or you can sort of use this as a kind of a reference piece. The idea is to think about how, if you've got one page to tell a story, you might tell a story through a combination of text and images. So as you're thinking about that, consider what is the story that you want to tell? Which genre are you working in? Is there a narrator? Or is there dialogue? Do the visuals convey the key information, or is there text as well? What motifs connect to the visual idioms within the ethnographic concept? Do you have something like the framework? Or in this case, this is one of Chicho's pages, kind of the net and the horizon as kind of key motifs that are shifting your point of view in order to focus you, the reader, on different aspects of the boat and its location within the delta. What are the motifs that are doing that sort of connecting? And then in step 3, as you're kind of thinking about writing it, there's some useful terms that might guide your practice. And this is one of the pages of Forecasts, my graphic ethnography. Do you need an establishing shot that locates the scene and just lets the reader know where we are and kind of who's part of the social landscape? Do you need to think about lighting? What mood are you conveying with light or dark tones? What sort of perspective are you establishing in each one of your panels? What angle are you viewing the scene from? And this matters, right, when you think about the kind of perspective of the anthropologist. Very often in anthropology of finance, the view is from 10,000 feet, right? You sort of see kind of economies in whole cloth kind of functioning in all of their interdependent parts, and you see that kind of from the top down. Or is the angle kind of more situated around a particular device or object? So are you in a meeting room? Are you talking to people? Are you kind of in a landscape? Framing. So when you're sort of drawing boundaries around things, you're both separating and uniting them, right? Putting them in relation to one another and thinking about the movement between different panels, but also kind of establishing particular points of view. And gutters are the space all the way around the page, which also can play an important role. Are you sort of uniting everything into one page? Are you dividing it by having sort of different colors, letting an image cross, for example, the entire page, as Sopranzetti's does, extending margin to margin? Or are you bounding it with kind of frames? And if we think about some of the most successful comics, they're often really simple, right? So if you think just like basic layouts, right? 3 panels. And often that shows a sequence in time. You can show a ball being thrown, right? Or the kind of classic Mickey Mouse ones, right? We sort of know something's happening in the first panel, like 2 people together, and by the end, like Mickey's got, stars, he's fallen over. So you know 3 things, like something has happened over the course of these 3 panels, and you can convey that without words at all, right? Just through sequence. 3 snapshots of things that have happened. And yet anthropologists' temptation is to over-explain it, right? To tell you in gory detail every single thing that has happened at each one of those stages. And yet the joy and the beauty of graphic ethnography is that you can show time unfolding rather than explain how it unfolds. So, temptation to over-dialogue. Sophie, really well done. Thank you. It's the first kind of thing that we learn as we're doing graphic ethnography. Anyone else? Big epiphanies? Group here, you were very active. What were your big learnings?
You think about demonstration. I did it everything.
Let's show us how it works. Yes, and using So conveying movement is
motion
so
is
hard,
different.
right? So do you cut that up as 3 panels, like the door closed, the door half open, and then the
Yes.
fully open door?
Yes.
Or you kind of use other textual idioms, right? Onomatopoeia. And I say one of the funniest things about working with Paraguayans on this is that their onomatopoeia is different from mine. And so there's a kind of a page that they translated into English for me where there was a kind of tech worker who was trying to hook up to a weather station. He had his kind of laptop off, cords everywhere. And Enrique and David put like clickety clackety as cues like to typing. And I would never have thought that as the onomatopoeia. That's perfect, right? It's like absolutely kind of genius. And even though like oh and that they're using are sort of conveying both the sensorium as well as the visual kind of idioms. So you have the opportunity to play with sequence in the sense that one decision would be to do one page that has something happen, a snapshot in time, and then you say what's happening with dialogue or sound, or you can cut it up into panels, right? And play with time by separating into 3 parts of the sequence. Anyone else? Big have questions, learnings? Cool, we'll have some more opportunities to reflect on this, and I know that we're kind of scooting right along, so I'll kind of keep us going. As we think about going from the script to the page, there's a lot of ways of incorporating text in graphic ethnography. If you're like Sophie and you're challenged by the word limit on kind of a page, you might think about the narrative voice as you're going. So here, this is a great page because we have dialogue happening within the scene as different kind of people are talking to one another, and in some cases kind of thinking. You can have thought bubbles as well. And then on the left-hand side, you have the anthropologist kind of self-reflexively engaging theoretically and conceptually with what's happening in that scene. So you end up with a kind of double loop where you have a narrator on the one side and then also a sort of interactive dynamic happening on the page itself. You can also think about intertextuality, so how you can kind of convey key sentiments and ideas, not just with text, but also with visual kind of sensibilities. This is one page that we developed that riffs on some really classic Latin American kind of graphic historietas or comics. And they're so kind of visually iconic in Latin America that we can rely on our reader to make the connections and to kind of think both about the kind of original comic and its own sort of political sensibilities. It was written by an Argentinian kind of scriptwriter who was kind of forcibly disappeared, murdered in an extrajudicial killing during the Dirty Wars in Argentina. And so it's already a kind of highly politicized kind of commentary on Argentinian society. We can pick up some of those stylistic motifs that are circulating within Paraguay and repurpose them to tell a story of our own and in place one of our protagonists kind of in that frame. You can also think about playing with temporality. This is one of my absolute favorite kind of graphic projects by Richard McGuire's, who over the course of his book looks at one room over decades. So that same shot happens over time, page after page after page after page, as the scene kind of changes. So you can hold something still and then change other aspects of the visual as you go. Or the sort of comic book conventions of kind of playing with multiple timelines and kind of thinking about the ontology of multiple timelines is something that's very kind of common in kind of comic books, and yet anthropology really struggles with thinking otherwise, right? We have all sorts of ways of theorizing and talking through and kind of analytically engaging with kind of multiple alternatives and alternative points of view, and yet comics has a well-developed visual idiom to accomplish exactly that, and much more elegantly, should I say, than much of the clunky writing that we do in anthropology. So as you're thinking about your kind of one-pager and what you sort of accomplished, you can kind of think about the fact that you don't need to be an illustrator to accomplish some of these analytical goals. You can be at, instead of XKCD, kind of stick figure, kind of level of illustration, and convey a really important and kind of crucial point, right? I absolutely love this comic, by the way. I think it's fantastic. Or you can sort of work in collage, for example. So this is one page that we kind of made that picked up kind of archival images from Paraguay and then superimpose them in creative ways. And so you're kind of repurposing kind of images that already exist. So there's lots of ways in which you could be a visual anthropologist and a graphic ethnographer. Most of us already are, as we're kind of thinking visually in our fieldwork and using kind of illustration in our own field note-taking practice. So take this as an invitation to do it. You have all of the tools, and there's lots of really creative ways in which you can think through it. So, on to Q&A.